Our gospel lesson for this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 13. Now, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and quite unable to stand straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid hands on her, immediately she stood up and started praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, not on the Sabbath day." But Jesus answered him and said, "You hypocrite, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all of his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at the wonderful things done by him. Amen. If you follow national news, you're probably aware that for many years there have been efforts to post the 10 Commandments in public buildings, especially schools and courthouses. While well-intended, there are, of course, legal issues involved in here, but there's actually a more fundamental problem when it comes to posting the 10 Commandments. There are actually different versions of the 10 Commandments. Everyone agrees there are 10, but there is no agreement on just how they're numbered and what they say. For Lutherans and Catholics, for example, the commandment for our sermon today to keep the Sabbath is the 3rd commandment. But for Jews, Moravians, and most Protestants, it is the 4th commandment. Now, if you want to, you can look at page 32 in your book of worship, and you'll see a list of 10 commandments in our liturgy for grace. That short list is probably closest to what you may have memorized in Sunday school or confirmation. And you'll notice that the 4th line simply says, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." But in the Bible, it's a much longer commandment. I'll read what it says in Deuteronomy 5. Pardon my voice. "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days shall you labor and do all of your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son nor daughter, nor your male or female servants, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." Unlike the list of 10 commandments we usually see and how they appear in our liturgy, this passage explains how and why the Sabbath was a holy day. It was holy for the Israelites because it was the day to rest. The Hebrew word Sabbath literally means to rest or cease from doing something. I remember when one of our daughters was at that age when she was always talking, especially in the car. I can tell some of you had children that did that as well. Julie and I occasionally would go through a drive-through to pick up a milkshake so she had something else to do with her mouth. We were, in effect, taking a Sabbath from the chatter. Now, as far as historians can determine, the Israelites were the only people in the ancient world to have a day of rest every week. The Babylonians invented the 7-day week, but it was the Israelites who insisted that there was a day to rest and not work. Believe it or not, the Moravians in Pennsylvania were the first people in America to observe a 2-day weekend. They took Saturday as a Sabbath and Sunday as a day for worship. They understood that Sunday worship is a form of work we do for the Lord. It's not a rest unless you nap during your sermons. I must confess, occasionally in church, Julie has poked me and said, "Were you napping or praying?" When I was teaching Western religions at Salem College many years ago, I found that few of my Christian students could actually tell me what the Sabbath was. Most of them assumed that the Sabbath is Sunday and that the Sabbath meant it was the day to go to church. They were surprised to learn that the commandment to keep the Sabbath holy was not about worship, and in Jewish timekeeping, the Sabbath is the last day of the week. It starts on sundown Friday and ends at sundown Saturday. So I hear people say we should make the 10 Commandments part of national law, but could you imagine what would happen in modern America if from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, no stores or restaurants could be open, or movie theaters, no sports on Friday night, no kids' soccer, golf, cookouts, buying or selling, no traveling by plane, train, or automobile. When our daughter Sarah was living in Brooklyn, we would sometimes go visit her on a Saturday afternoon, and we always knew when we got to Crown Heights because everything was closed because it was a Jewish neighborhood. Rather than discussing what should and shouldn't be allowed on the Sabbath, though, I think it's important to look at the purpose of the Sabbath in the Bible. According to the passage in Deuteronomy I read, the reason the Israelites had a weekly day of rest was to remind them that their ancestors had been enslaved in Egypt and were not allowed to rest. This was so important, they would not erase it from their memory, but remember every week that their ancestors had been forced to toil in the equatorial sun all day, every day, with just enough food and water to keep them alive so they could work. They did not have the luxury of rest, reflection, relaxation, and recreation. Their life was nothing but toil. The Sabbath was the reminder that God had rescued their ancestors from slavery. But it wasn't just about celebration and gratitude for freedom. God instructed the Israelites to also treat their own workers, servants, and even their animals with more compassion than they had experienced in Egypt. God did not free the children of Israel from bondage so they could abuse and exploit others. Resting on the seventh day was a reminder that we worship God by showing compassion to others. And then the Old Testament lesson that Jenny read reiterates the point. The prophet Isaiah reminded the Jews who were returning to the promised land to keep the Sabbath holy. They must not trample the Sabbath by using that as a day to pursue their own pleasure or profit. The Sabbath should be a day of rest from greed, competition, and exploitation. And the prophet told the Jews if they could refrain from abusing others just one day a week, they will be blessed. So all that is background so you can understand the tension in the gospel story we have today. So Jesus is teaching in the synagogue when he saw a crippled woman walking in. She would have been walking in the segregated section for women. She may have been coming to beg for alms, or she may have simply come to prayer. She obviously is coming late since Jesus is already teaching, but it takes a long time to walk when you're bent over. The men listening to Jesus did not even notice the woman. She was just another old woman bent double by disease and age. She was not worth their time or attention. We're told that she had been bent for 18 years, which is a long time. I know people who have been bent for many years. As you probably know, we're more sympathetic to people when they're first injured or get sick. If they stay sick or impaired, we tend to get bored and look away. We get tired of their chronic condition and thoughtlessly exclude them instead of inviting them into our community. And I'm sure that's what happened to this old woman. I bet no one even looked at her as she made her way into the building. No one noticed her except the teacher, the rabbi who was opening the scriptures to people. Jesus called out to her. I'm sure the crippled woman was shocked when Jesus spoke to her, shocked that Jesus didn't avert his eyes from her suffering, shocked that a rabbi no less, spoke to a woman in a synagogue. I imagine she was at first afraid that she was being singled out to prove a point about how people suffer for their sins, as so many people had told her in the past. Instead, Jesus tells her that she is free from her affliction. Jesus got up from the seat where he was teaching and walked over to the women's area of the synagogue as people looked on in surprise. Then he laid his hands on this poor woman who most people considered untouchable. And Luke tells us that the unnamed woman immediately stood up straight and praised God. For the first time in 18 years, she could look to the heavens with gratitude and could look her neighbors in the eyes. Just imagine the scene that Jesus made when he broke ancient rules and traditions that segregate and diminished some people, in this case women and infirm people. Rules that separated the healthy from the afflicted, that separated rabbis from the people, that made the Sabbath day itself restrictive and burdensome instead of liberating. Now, up to this point in the story, this is a typical healing story in the Gospels. All the elements are there. There's a crowd. There's a crippled woman. Jesus tells her she is well. He touches her. She praises God. And it's a beautiful story. And we could end right there. But like in the old Twilight Zone, there's a twist at the end of the story that moves it from beautiful to profound. The leader of the synagogue just could not restrain himself. Now, the leader of a synagogue was usually a wealthy man who kept the synagogue in good repair, the man who organized everything, kind of like the president of a board of trustees of a college. He probably had slaves to care for him and was used to everyone listening to him when he spoke up in public. He was probably a good, pious man, a benefactor. He may have even given alms to this woman week after week, or at least ordered her servants to bring her food. But this really upset him. Had Jesus simply pointed to the woman and urged the audience to show compassion to the afflicted and homeless, the leader of the synagogue might have nodded in agreement. But when Jesus dared to heal her on the Sabbath day in the middle of the congregation, he was indignant, we are said. He was so angry he lost his dignity. You can just see him ranting. He felt the need to mansplain to everyone what Jesus had done. To teach Jesus the Jewish laws and tradition, how much temerity to do that. He openly criticized Jesus and pointed out he could have waited till Sunday to cure. As if Jesus didn't know that. She's been crippled for 18 years. Would one more day matter? I think we can call Jesus' action in this sermon provocative compassion. Yes, he could have waited and avoided making a scene, but he intentionally and publicly reached out in compassion so everyone would see. He seized the opportunity of this woman walking into the synagogue to teach what compassion means. To violate the sanctity of the Sabbath by healing someone. Jesus dared to touch an afflicted woman and set her free from the illness that enslaved her, because that is actually what the Sabbath is all about. The Sabbath was not intended to place burdens on people or to add to their sufferings. It was to liberate them. We do not keep the Sabbath holy by showing everyone how righteous and special we are. The Sabbath is not just a day without work. It is about reaching out in love to care for people. When we feed the hungry, heal the broken, give hope to the despondent, and liberate the oppressed from whatever it is that oppresses them, we observe the Sabbath. Any day and every day, including this day, can be a Sabbath day. And as the prophet Isaiah told the Jews long ago, if you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom will be like midday. May we take God's teaching into our hearts. Amen.